Hi there, I'm Steve Smith, CEO of Airlink, and thank you for joining me for another episode of FlightPath. Here we aim to highlight innovation, deliver insight, actionable guidance, and lessons in best practice to people working in the humanitarian response and disaster logistics space, all from experienced leaders. And please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. My guest today has often been called a turnaround expert, and as a C-suite operator, he previously took airlines on the brink of bankruptcy and turned them into profitable going concerns. To name but a few, the list of airlines he's turned around have included Air Malta, Air Southwest, Caribbean Airlines, SN Brussels Airlines, and before that, he was a man largely responsible for establishing DHL's operations across Europe. There's very little about successful management this man doesn't know. In fact, he's even founded his own consultancy, the Airline Management Group, to advise airlines facing existential and significant threats to their existence. And given the current state of aviation industry due to COVID-19, I should imagine this is somewhat of a growth industry. Peter Davies, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm doing well, thank you. Good to see you.
Right.
Peter, I probably haven't done your career justice in my intro, so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe also a little bit about what your organization, Airline Management Group, or AMG, is focused on today.
Well, I've been in aviation all my life. I landed my first aeroplane, sat on the lap of Freddie Laker, a York aircraft at Stansted Airport way back in the 1950s. My grandfather, who was a farmer, knew Freddie quite well, so that was the connection. And we lived quite close to Heathrow. My father was a pilot during the Second World War, so I've always been involved in aviation and the smell of the kerosene. So it was natural for me to go into some form of aviation, originally as a pilot, but then went on to management and got involved in both passenger and cargo. You said Airline Management Group, my own company, as a consultant. Actually, I much prefer to call it a practitioner. In my many years at sea level, I've either been told to or I've used many of the large consultancy companies. And they provided some fantastic insight, deep dive analysis and really accurate, fast insights in terms of data and some understanding strategically of what's happening in the airline market. But what I found very frustrating as a CEO was that they write fantastic plans, but in order to implement those plans, you need to have a management team. And often it's the management team that's taken the airline into bankruptcy or near bankruptcy in the first place. So what I decided to do was to set up an organization that was represented by people who've got hands-on experience in the airline management business, both cargo and passenger, and across the whole spectrum of airline management, from sea level all the way through to flying to ground control, engineering, etc. Because I think it's important that it's one thing to write a fantastic report. It's another to implement it, and the implementation skills is about management and how you create that environment, that sense of leadership that gives people inspiration and hope, particularly if you're involved in a company that's going through some pretty bad times. And my career has spent, I suppose, fixing things. Ever since a child, I've enjoyed fixing things, and I suppose I may have learned that from my grandparents, I suppose. But in those days, you had to fix things rather than buy things. But seriously, I think it's a question of trying to create something out of something that was once good, but has lost its way or whatever the circumstances. So I relish that. I enjoy that. And I really encourage people to join and give them that hope and inspiration. It's about leading people, not pushing people, and I think that's one of my mantras. Is quite key to creating and fixing problems, particularly airlines. Great fun.
That's great. Yes, it's very clear. Your passion is very clear, Peter. That's great. And so, I've known you for many years now, and I want to declare an interest. You actually serve on Airlink's board of directors, and you have done for a number of years. And also are chair of Airlink's Governors Council, which is a group of airline and aviation CEOs that support Airlink's mission. Additionally, you've also been a mentor to me personally over the years, and so I suppose you could say that we've we know each other pretty well. But from talking to you and having the benefit of your counsel, I know that management is ubiquitous. That is to say, a good manager or C-suite leader tends to operate with the same set of principles and has a very similar mindset, whether they know it or not, and regardless of the sector or industry they work in. So if you can learn some of those lessons, maybe, and some of those principles, you might just be a successful leader in whatever forum you operate. And so the reason for having you here, Peter, is that the airline industry and the nonprofit sector share a number of similarities. And I would argue perhaps neither is particularly well understood by the outside world. Both sectors run very tight margins and budgets, and it's very easy to run out of money quickly. And both sectors are suffering profound economic challenges resulting as of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you know this, but Airlink and the Clinton Global Initiative did a survey on nonprofit disaster relief in the sector and found 80% of responding organizations had funding issues, and 65% of the responding organizations were extremely concerned about that funding. Peter, you alluded to a second ago within AMG and as a group of practitioners, and you on a personal level, I know you've done a deep dive into not just airline and aviation sector, but other areas too, and you've noted some similarities. Can you tell me a little bit more about some of your thoughts on that?
Well, we're obviously going through very difficult times. That's obvious. But to be a CEO, you have to be the eternal optimist, and I think this is an opportunity to reset. You have to reset the dials. I mean, the issue is short-term liquidity. If we're able to get through that, and everyone's managing that to the best of their ability, obviously simply by reducing capacity and keeping aircraft on the ground, the passengers aren't there yet. And that they would obviously clearly take some time before they come back. Certainly long haul, short haul's beginning to pick up a little bit as we speak, but the nature of the beast is that it's going to be consumer led, and consumers won't be happy until such time as they feel comfortable and safe. And governments likewise with the different rules and regulations, which I can understand individual governments and states and counties and countries making decisions, but it doesn't create a particularly good level playing field for airlines to manage. But I think equally there's an opportunity. You've got to reset the dials. The key for me is making sure, and if I was CEO of an airline at the moment and we're advising a couple, is obviously your immediate management is concentrating on the short-term liquidity. When can we get the aircraft back in the sky? All the obvious things. But their real concern should be making sure they don't mortgage the future. So therefore, what are they going to do in 1 year, 2 years' time? Because this is going to take a long time for this market to recover. And short-term liquidity creates an immediate relief. But don't mortgage the future. So I think the potential is for a second or third wave, not of coronavirus, although that may well happen, but certainly a second or third wave of financial bankruptcies, airline bankruptcies going into the future. So I think people have got to be very concerned about making sure that they make decisions which have lasting impact as opposed to knee-jerk at the present moment.
Interesting. And so talk to me a little bit about, not necessarily in detail in terms of airline profitability, but to the outside world, I think it's commonly fairly well misunderstood. Around airlines making lots of money, and you have specific views on that, right? That you've observed and experienced over time.
Well, a few airlines make a lot of money, but a handful. I think the stats are that something like only 14 or 15 airlines produce 80% of the profits pre-COVID-19, and the margins are very tight. I think it's important to understand that whilst we're an airline, we are essentially, in marketing and retail sense, a fast-moving consumer goods. And there's nothing more perishable than an empty aircraft seat on takeoff. So we obviously paramount is safety, so everyone works to that. That sets a certain level in terms of costs, and quite rightly so. It's a question then of how can you differentiate your product, either in the value you bring to the passenger or in the price that you give, that makes them compelling to fly you rather than someone else. And often, and I'm talking about generally economy here, not so much premium class, although that's critically important. And airlines very specifically differentiate themselves by way of product. But at the end of the day, someone decides from A to B, particularly short or medium haul, what's it going to cost me? The frequency good, the flight times okay for me to travel, and what's the cost? When you do analysis, actually cost is often 3 or 4 down the path. Safety actually comes behind cost. So it depends on what the person's looking for, but essentially it's narrow margins, significant capacity, well, at least there has been, with better aircraft, more capacity, and how you outdo your competition if you can't differentiate your product sufficiently well enough. Is simply to zap in capacity and outbid them on price. And that what tends to happen is that the price, you go into the classic spiral, and you're forever dealing with a competitive environment. So it's pretty tough. I think sometimes it's self-inflicted, to be honest. But having said that, the marketplace has grown fantastically. We often say that the airline industry was the vanguard, if you like, for globalization, the ability to be able to fly from A to B at very economic prices. And I remember many years ago, SN, Ryanair was then a relatively small company, and the people at Sabina were saying that the problem with Sabina was was Ryanair, amongst other things. And I said, well, I don't entirely believe that. And it's a classic, actually, because many airline management companies often say that it's the competition's fault rather than themselves. Head in the sand and add some cement. But I did a survey at Charleroi in Brussels, and it was quite categoric in as much that 76%, this is in 2001, of the people flying on Ryanair had never flown before. And therefore they were creating, because they were low fares, a significant market. And I said, look, this is fantastic. They're increasing the size of the market. What we've got to do is to differentiate ourselves from Ryanair. I remember I coined the expression in those days, Ryanair flew nowhere to nowhere. Now that's changed. As opposed, we flew from Brussels, Zaventem. So I think it's a question of how do you approach the marketplace and how do you convince the management team that because it's a tough competitive market and it's everyone else's fault. No, at the end of the day, often 9 times out of 10, it's the management that's taken themselves into that cul-de-sac, and the rest is history in terms of how airlines find themselves in this predicament. It's a tough industry. It's a dog-eat-dog business. We're all friends because the nature of the safety relationships that we have and the camaraderie in making sure we don't hurt anyone is paramount. But believe me, in the marketplace, it's a tough old market.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let me change tack a little bit. Thank you, Peter. And talk a little bit more about some of the underlying sort of leadership challenges that the organizations will be facing today. You've talked about the management groups of short-term versus long-term focus. Talk to me a little bit about the mindset, that you need in order to either turn around an organization or, I suppose, almost in some ways, restart an organization in the current environment.
Well, there's a lot of frightened people in the marketplace at the moment in terms of their job safety and their own individual positions, and the whole world is confused at the present moment. So these are unique situations that we haven't faced, at least this generation, including myself, in that being post-war baby, haven't really faced even beyond 2008 and other notable events that have happened on the global calendar. So I think certainly leadership becomes paramount, but the difficulty and the issue is making sure that you can create a sense of purpose, a sense of hope and inspiration, that whatever is thrown at you, and the current economic position is dire, that there are opportunities beyond that. So you've really got to sell that idea. And the CEO in that sense is and should be always the chief salesman, and certainly in turnaround situations, the three groups of people who I tend to concentrate in priority are the staff first, a very close second are the customers, and a long way third is the shareholders. Now, boards and shareholders get quite confused about that, but my concern is that if you look after and make sure you manage both your staff and your customers, then the shareholders tend to be taken care of, because you should get good results from that sort of direction. And it's about trying to understand what the issues are. So the last thing I'll be doing as a CEO would be sitting behind my desk. I'll be out talking to people, talking to staff, what customers I have got, but also speaking to suppliers and making sure that we are in a good position to recover financially, having hopefully resolve the short-term liquidity problems, but making sure there's enough people thinking about, well, okay, fine, we're going to come out of this. We have to come out of this. There'll be some medical resolution or whatever. So what are we going to do then? Now is the opportunity to make those changes, to use the disruption as a further disruption within your own business. You have to, just to survive.
Yeah, yeah. Well, can you, a question is, can you be a nice guy or a nice woman and an effective leader? And I suppose a second part of that question is, critical attributes of successful peacetime leaders versus crisis and recovery leaders. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not quite sure if it's a nice guy or bad guy. I think it's the CEO's responsibility to create the right environment in which others can work to the best of their ability. That means choosing the right people at sea level, and not wishing to be employing sycophants, but you have to employ like-minded people so you have a common objective. There may be discussions and debates and sometimes arguments as to how you reach that objective, but you've got to be like-minded in terms of where you place the priorities. And certainly for me, the priorities have always been making sure that the staff are adequately led, trained, motivated, inspired to provide the levels of service necessary for our customers, whether it be cargo or passengers. So as a result of that, nice guy doesn't really come into it. You're just making sure that people understand and you're crystal clear in your communications and your focus, and you convey a simple message. That's not patronising. It's a simple message to implore to people that we have a job to do. This is what I expect you to do. And in all my experiences, particularly in turnarounds, I've always followed the same pattern. I've obviously read all the papers and got up to date before I've actually taken on the job. And every single airline I've joined, or any cargo organisation, I've always flown that airline incognito. No one knew. I paid my own ticket. I just flew the airline, booked the ticket myself. So I understood from a customer's perspective how this airline works. And you talk to the crews, and they don't know who you are. And then when I join, I tend to obviously have a meeting with your managers and the board and all that sort of stuff. But then I immediately go on walkabout. I start talking to the people on the ramp and in the cockpit, or engineering, wherever. So I get a better feel, because those people actually do the job. They know where the problems are. They manage the processes, and they often know where it's broken. And you do that in conjunction with the unions where necessary. I've had a good relationship with them, and you begin to convey to them that you're actually interested in what they do, as opposed to sitting somewhere and just sending out orders. So leadership is about creating that right environment. If people perceive me to be a nice guy as a result of that, then fine. But equally, you have to make some pretty tough decisions, and obviously one's done those, and you have to be ruthless at times. But I think if you've explained the situation and you put your logic into some sort of form of communication, in my experience, and different cultures around the world, more often than not, they bought into that.
Interesting. And so I think, one of my questions for you was going to be, what is more likely to cripple an organization? Is it the external event occurring around it, or is it wrong people, wrong jobs, wrong time? I think you probably just answered that.
Yeah, well, I can be very more specific, and without exception, yeah, the senior management who've employed the middle management and supervisory management are clearly the ones that have taken it into a level of you know, bankruptcy or significant losses. And clearly, by the time I've come in with my team, they've probably moved on. But the middle management are still in place. And those guys, those individuals, hold the strategic conduit between management and grassroots. And they can be positive with that, they can be negative, they can be malicious. So I tend to bypass those people and go straight to the grassroots, as I explained, to make sure that the people at the ground who do the job of flying the passengers, serving them coffee, chief or whatever they're doing, I can communicate and understand their end of the business and begin to interpret what their needs are. Now, that's not to say that you capitulate, oh, I want a 10% salary increase. Actually, it's much more cleverer than that when you start talking to the people at the grassroots in terms of, as I said, they know exactly what the situation is and they're very honest in terms of how that can be improved. If only my manager would listen to me. So what I've tended to do is approach it top down, but also bottom up. And you put a squeeze on management, middle management. Now they don't like that, and they normally buckle if they're weak because more than my job's worth, or more importantly, or as importantly, you through that process you find really the strong characters in that company who've been there all their time, all their life, but they just haven't been able to pop up above the parapet for whatever reason. So I'm always proud that whenever I've moved on from an airline, 99% of the people that were there as employees of the airline were still there. So I haven't gone for wholesale changes, but it's mindset with middle management. So that's where often the problem lies.
Yeah, interesting. Well, a number of the listeners for this for FlightPath will be leaders of a number of different organizations, including NGOs. And so, here we are in the middle of the pandemic. Maybe some, the aviation sector is certainly affected just as much, if not more, than many other industries. What are some sort of practical things that you could think of those leadership of those organizations and perhaps even the senior management of those organizations should be, which are also leaders, should be focused on?
Well, they must be having very difficult times at the present moment because we have a pandemic and COVID-19, which is affecting capacity, aircraft availability, passenger seats, cargo seats is obviously significantly downturned. It's a question of how can you manage to carry on your charitable work, the needs of the different issues that we face around the world. I guess a high percentage of their time must be spent on COVID-19. I mean, the SARS and Ebola were very specific, geographically located, and therefore you could put those resources into that particular area. And globally, it was less affected. But clearly, in this case, the whole world was affected and significant reduction in capacity. So the difficulty, I suppose, for NGOs is how do they provide the level of service, that urgent level of service, that level of compassion in terms of making sure they continue serving those people who are not COVID-19 affected, but in very difficult positions. I mean, that must be one of the toughest things they face at the present moment. And the difficulty, I suppose, and I have no answer for that, is how on earth do they prioritise? Because you now have limited resources, presumably money is short. Capacity is not as available as it was, yet you've still got these issues and increasing issues through COVID-19. So I suppose priorities becomes critical. And in that sense, I suppose if I was an NGO management, would I be listening to the medical people? The jury's out in terms of the different advice that governments get on COVID-19, so I'm not quite sure what action I would take. But you have to prioritize and make sure that what limited resources you have is being sent by an arrow as opposed to a more open shot.
Yeah, yeah. And as you understood, and as you know, Airlink is working on its aviation cares program to support COVID-19, and part of the focus of that is to help airlines rally even in such a difficult time to help move medical supplies, protective gear around the world, and it's continues to be surprising and not so much surprising, but really inspiring as to how much the airlines around the world are doing lots and lots of things to help, even though their businesses are down to what, less than 5% of the traffic that they're used to, and so that's pretty amazing to see.
Well, I think it's
Now, Peter,
remarkable how airlines have reacted. Obviously not just the cargo aircraft they're flying all the time, but there's a lot of airlines around the world who've using passenger aircraft. They're able to consign boxes onto seats and strap them down correctly, and all that technical stuff to make sure the aircraft is safe has been outstanding. So the airline industry has clearly responded and responded well where possible. But I think the other significance is that I guess it's not just the airlines that's going to have to reset the dials. The whole world, I suppose, is going to reset the dials, and the PPE has been an issue in terms of the location of principal manufacturing. And I think certainly speaking to colleagues around the world, that sense of less reliability upon one or two sources that's been highlighted as a result of PPE and other factors may well change the way in which people approach manufacturing in the future. So I think the ramifications of COVID-19, apart from the human tragedy, is going to be quite significant in terms of how different businesses approach this problem, including the airline industry, of course.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Peter, you gave me an example when we were speaking the other day, coming back to sort of leadership principles, and I thought it was quite a nice story. Maybe you'd like to share it. Because you used to be a formidable rugby player, right? and so I wondered if you wanted to share that story on here.
Well, we were talking about leadership, and sometimes you have to be economical with the truth. I don't like lying, clearly, but sometimes to make a point, you have to use anecdotes or extremes, and I often like to use true stories as opposed to make up lies. But my eldest grandson was playing rugby a year or so ago, and when I was taught that you pass the ball, you pass it flat. You look at the person's chest and you fly it to that. You pass it to that point, and that keeps the ball level, less time in the air, etc. So I watched the first half, and he and all his colleagues were throwing the ball up in the air and being dropped. And anyway, half time, and he said, "So, Grandpa, what do you think of the first half?" I said, "Great." I said, "What I like is the fact that every time you pass the ball, you listen to what I said." And he said, "What was that?" I said, "You pass it flat." Fantastic, and a little spiral on it, so a bit of show off there. And he said, "Oh, really? Okay." And every single ball he passed in the second half was dead flat. So it was just that recognition, just a reminder that actually he obviously had a quizzical look. He did he said, I can't recall passing it flat, but I'm sure I did. But he just focused on that particular point, and that provides an element of, it's a very simple story, but it's an element of, it's a true story, it's an element of truth. And he's never forgotten that. And I think it's the sort of things that my grandfather taught me when I was just sitting on his tractors at Stansted Airport all those years ago.
Very good, very good. Well, I always like to try and finish on a positive note. A lot of good things here, but Peter, as we look to the future, from a global perspective, it's a pretty open question, I suppose. What should we be feeling optimistic about?
That's a question to a politician, I think. But as a human being, you have to be optimistic. But an awful lot of people who are pessimistic and obviously going through some very difficult times. I mean, and we're not just going through COVID-19. We're going through some a huge transformation, if you like, I suppose, in how people relate to each other. COVID-19, the financial implications, disposable income is hit a lot of people. I think it's got to hit a lot more people as we go into the winter in the northern hemisphere, and obviously, southern hemisphere will be affected. Has already been affected. So the ramifications of this coupled together is quite significant. Where probably the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, and that's obviously a very worrying situation. The politicians have to provide leadership, guidance, reassurance in terms of making sure that they understand that environment in which the average person, wherever they live, is facing at the present moment. I'm not quite entirely sure if that's top of mind generally throughout the globe. I don't want to be political about it, but I think we have to make sure we have to step back and say, what sort of world are we trying to move to going forward? And I think there's a huge amount of optimism. Stephen, in all my experiences, 99% of the world's population are good. We only ever hear about the 1%. And I think that always needs to be put into context in terms of the average human being, regardless of colour, creed, or religion, anywhere in the world, tend to want to do the right thing as opposed to want to do the bad thing. And I think, therefore, human nature has to come through, and hopefully that will come through by its own virtue. But sometimes it needs a nudge, and someone needs to create that environment, and that's where politicians fall into. The last anecdote I will say to you is one from my grandfather, and that is that he said, when you grow up, Peter, always remember that you are going to cul-de-sacs in your life. That is a fact of life. But when you do, make sure you know you're going into it and reverse it. Don't drive in.
That's good. Well, Peter, I thank you very much. I think that's all we have time for today.
Pleasure.
I'd like to thank you as my guest. Yes, you too, for joining me today. I thank you for your enduring support of Airlink's mission and our NGO partners. For sure, you're a leader that walks the walk and talks the talk, and have great stories to tell. We're grateful for your support, Peter. To everybody watching and listening, thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. This is Steve Smith at Airlink in Washington, D.C., wishing you, your families, good health and safe skies ahead. Goodbye.